Oh, I'm gonna be hurting tomorrow at work, man. It is almost 1 o'clock in the morning, and I have not slept all week. I had one night where I took NyQuil because I couldn't take it, and that messed me up for the whole next day. Another night like this, and I'm gonna have to start challenging Damien for his title as Sleepy Reader. What's up, Damien? All right, so I figured instead of tossing and turning and cussing and just getting frustrated and kicking blankets and just make a video, right? So I looked on the shelf and I'm like, well, let's talk about some X-Men. Let's go back to 1986 with Marvel, their 25th anniversary. I'm going by memory here, 86 and 87, those were two potent years in comics, man. They really were. A lot was going on. All kinds of companies were starting, like Dark Horse. The indie market just kind of boomed that year. It had been around with Eclipse and First Comics and Pacific Comics, and then it just, bam, it just hit. We were coming out of stuff like Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC was starting to kind of rebuild. John Byrne was on Superman, and the Legends of miniseries was getting rolling, and they were building towards things like a new Justice League. George Perez was on Wonder Woman. Dark Horse Comics Presents #1 came out that year, I think. All kinds of stuff was going on. And the new universe was starting to celebrate Marvel's 25th anniversary year. And if you go back and look in an issue of Legends, I want to say it's might be #1. They kind of take a shot at Jim Shooter and Starbrand in it, one of those issues. That's another video. And we were coming out of the Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and I think they were getting Batman Year 1 rolling, and that carried over to 1987, where we got Year 2 and Year 3, and then we were seeing McFarlane kind of coming up and taking off to Marvel to do Spider-Man and getting Venom. So those 2 years kind of connected, man. 85, and then they tore everything down. 86 was anniversaries and new companies and making everything, and then into 87 we were seeing the stuff come to fruition. And right dab smack in the middle of this, man, you could tell Marvel had been planning something, right? This stuff just didn't fall together by accident and stuff, right? Go back a few years to lead up to the Morlock Massacre is what I want to talk about here, if you've hung in there with me, man. The Morlocks first debuted in X-Men 169, and they're mutants who have gave up on the surface world of humans and went down in the tunnels, and a lot of them named themselves after Shakespearean characters in his plays, like Caliban, Caliban. Oh man, it's 1 in the morning, just bear with me. But anyway, and and right off the bat on that first cover, man, you got the angel pinned by his wings down there, and all this stuff down in the sewers of New York and stuff. How of the Fallen and stuff. And X-Men were hot, man. I mean, Chris Claremont had all these subplots go on, and it was really strange because I was able to start really reading comics long enough at this time, even though I was just 13 in 1986, to see. I was beginning to suspect, we're never going to see the end of some of these little subplots that Chris Claremont had started in the X-Men, man. He was on that book forever and stuff, great stuff, right? And he'd developed the Morlocks, kept a little line going on there, and he kept the X-Men going. And all of a sudden, you started getting the idea that, if you were paying attention, you didn't realize what was going on, but if you were reading your comics and keeping up, they were building up to something. You started hearing sounds of, you started hearing, the echoes that, of rumors and stuff that, Jean Grey was coming back. And Jim Shooter had set up rules that, when she died in the Dark Phoenix saga, he made up some rules that you had to do it within the parameters of what he set up to bring Jean Grey back. And a guy named Kurt Busiek brought her back. So in X-Men 201, which was a hot book there for a while, you see Cyclops's and Madeline Pryor's baby, who ends up say this is the real first appearance of Cable, and all that stuff. But he's fighting for the leadership of the X-Men, and Storm wins and he leaves, right? At the same time, around the same time here, they were calling off the Defenders, which had the Beast and the Angel in it. This was also a Secret Wars 2 crossover, where the book ended, because something was coming. Jean Grey had come back in Fantastic Four 286 by John Byrne, and it was just a big time 2-part story that also hit in the Avengers. and this was the coming of X Factor. Okay, so X Factor hit, and they reunited all the original X-Men, right? And a few issues later, man, you know, they turned the Beast back to his human form, you know, like back in the Silver Age there, and you know, they're back, you know. And the X-Men were their own book, and Chris Claremont was not on this. I think Louise Simonson was editing the X books at the time and stuff, and Bob Layton came on this, and Jackson Geist came on there, and he was drawing it, and it just did not feel like an X book. I'm not going to lie, I mean, it did not have that touch. And I'm sure it didn't struggle. I'm sure the sales were good and stuff, and a few good things popped up. You know, the book was starting to shape up. We got Apocalypse popped up there and stuff. And then all of a sudden, in issue number 9, Louise Simonson is writing this. A guy named Terry Shoemaker is drawing this, I think. And all of a sudden, it's starting to feel a bit more. Now, if you want to know what this is, I actually had a cat back in the day. Had kittens on a stack of comics, and I didn't get rid of them and stuff. So, you know, I need to replace this. But by the time you get to the back of this, with all the momentum, you see this. It's a big, huge crossover. And here's a whole page on how to read it and all the books that are going to be involved in the Marvel Mutant Massacre. And this is the map. You know, they're letting you know what's coming and how to follow it. You know, all the books that are going to be involved. Now, this was a time where we're having, you know, big events like Crisis and Legend, Secret Wars 2, and stuff like that. And, you know, a lot is going on in comics, like I said. But this was still exciting because actual contained books having a crossover with another book was still rare. In the 60s, you'd have characters like X-Men pop up in the Avengers, and you know, they would fight and they'd pop up in each other's book. And then I think around the 70s, what's popping in my head is you had the big Avengers Defenders crossover, and that was, you know, pretty exciting. I wasn't collecting at the time, but I still remember the older guys who were collecting comics still talking about that. And around this time, I think you had Frank Miller had come off of his Born Again storyline in Daredevil, and I think it got passed on to Andy Seed, and a couple of years later they would have Daredevil versus Punisher. So even a few years after this, we had something crossover. It was still cool. So all of a sudden you got this contained story. Now, as years have gone by, what happened was Chris Claremont had the idea of the Morlock Massacre just taking place in the X-Men. Louise Simonson thought it was this big, huge story that deserved to be in other books, and they came up with the plan that they were just going to kind of paint a picture. Okay, you can read just the X-Men and follow it, or read just X Factor and follow it, but you're missing out on the whole picture. And it was hell for them. Nobody had really tried this before. And when you think about Louise Simonson coming up with this idea, just think about the fact that when she went over to DC and started writing Man of Steel and stuff like that, the Superman books had been trying to cross over and stuff. So this Morlock Massacre pops up, and you go in there and you're like excited about this, man, and then you just kind of see this, and this just tells you the times. You know, it's a book of the times, yet it still holds up. Come on, mess with us, make our day. The big Dirty Harry line, you know. So it starts out, man. You got this Morlock. I mean, she's very 80s, man. She's like a little clown that can turn. Well, she looks like a clown. She's very colorful. I think she can turn flat. And the first thing that happens, you're seeing, you know, somebody die. She's dating somebody with the Hellfire Club or something, man. And I think her name is Clown, and she's flipping out, and she's getting chased. And what she doesn't realize is that she is being tracked by these shadowy figures, and she's going to lead them right to the Morlock tunnels. And all hell breaks loose, okay? It just breaks loose. Now, the X-Men are battle weary at this time, right? They had just had the final showdown with one of Chris Claremont's subplots with a futuristic sentinel named Nimrod, which is a whole other video. Nimrod actually has ties going back to Alan Moore's Captain Britain run that we did not have here in America, so a lot of people didn't know it. Nightcrawler was hurt. I think Colossus took him on one-on-one. He was a little beat up, and Rogue was, her costume was tore all the crap and all this stuff in this. And they go right into, the Morlock Massacre and stuff. And, it starts out slow, and you start seeing the Hellfire Club, little subplots are still going on. You see X Factor finally pop up in this. And they go down into the tunnels, man. Okay, they get the call to come down into the tunnels because Storm is supposed to be their leader. and all this stuff, and it starts crossing over, and you get the borders and stuff. So you know how all this stuff's going down. I've actually had to recollect these and stuff. And Walt Simonson came on. He was writing Thor at the time, so it's going to cross over in Thor and everything like that. And they get down there, and it's just a massacre, man. You've got, Scalp Hunter and Riptide and all these characters coming up, man, and they're just vicious. I mean, there's Morlocks dying left and right. And a lot of the Morlocks that they had in here were just created to die. There's there's 5 or 6 of them that had already been established that died. And it is a fight. I mean, the whole thing it's a fight, and you're into this. I mean, this is just one action-packed thing after the moment. It's everybody getting ambushed. It's everybody going, what the hell's going on? I mean, it's just a flat-out war going on. Apocalypse pops up, and he's watching. Apocalypse is starting to be a player because you didn't know it at the time, but they've already got a plan of what they're going to do for the next few years. These are out of order and stuff, but let me put that in the back here. But it starts crossing over them, and you start seeing that there's some real things going on here. First thing that happens is Riptide ends up messing up a whole lot of them. This guy makes a little hurricane, around him, and then he throws shurikens, throwing stars, and they kind of penetrate Colossus, and he walks up and he breaks his neck. Right off the bat, Colossus breaks somebody's neck, and you're like, oh, this is a war. Kitty ends up not being able to phase back. I think Nightcrawler's in a coma or something like that. And already you got 3 major players coming on. And then it crosses over into Thor and stuff. They got a hold of Angel and pinned him to the wall with harpoons. A guy named Harpoon did it. And it goes back to that first cover where you see, Angel with his wings stuck to the wall there and stuff like that. And it's not good. It's not good at all. And they threw in the New Mutants there with Chris Claremont writing it and stuff. And crossed over, they threw in Power Pack. Sabretooth is just raising hell through this whole thing. Okay? I mean, he was just, going at it and stuff. And it was building up to a big showdown with Wolverine and Sabretooth, which happened. But another thing that happened was that this ended up making a character named Psylocke, who was Captain Britain's sister. She ended up taking on Sabretooth one-on-one on this stuff, and all of a sudden, man, bam, instant hit character, everybody loved her and stuff. And then you got the Alan Davis issue where you finally got to see Wolverine and Sabretooth go at it. This was not said to be part of the Morlock Massacre, but it ended up being that way. The story was so big. And then all of a sudden it just kind of popped up in Daredevil in an afterthought. The Mutant Massacre continues. It got thrown into Daredevil, okay, while this is going on. And there was a lot of stuff going on, because not only when this was coming out, Marvel was hitting you with a 1-2 punch where they were under siege. The Avengers were under siege by the Masters of Evil. Okay, they'd been building up to this for a while. This is issue 264, which is almost a year before we finally actually see the end of the fight. So I mean, there was a lot going on. The heroes were getting a big punch going on. Things were getting shook up a little bit. It even crossed over with Spider-Man. Spider-Man 283 for you completists out there and stuff. But the significance of the Morlock Massacre is quite a few things, right? Not only did it make, the big Psylocke star, not only did you get this big showdown, but a lot of X-Men fans were disturbed because in the aftermath of all this, this is where it cut the X-Men right down the center of their run. This is where they changed. You kind of had everything from the Silver Age leading up to the all-new X-Men and Giant Size X-Men #1, Phoenix Saga, on. And then all of a sudden, bam, the Morlock Massacre hits, and the books take a whole new turn. They leave the mansion eventually. They get new members, and you've got 3 of your most popular members: Nightcrawler, Colossus. Nightcrawler and Kitty mainly, took out of the picture and stuff like that. And it was so exciting and stuff, you didn't really notice the one big plot hole. Why are they showing up, the Marauders, these, hired hitmen, more or less, just out there just doing a big massacre, and it was a massacre. Why are they doing it? They never really said, but you're kind of used to Claremont having these big subplots, but you start catching on. All of a sudden you start having these offbeat issues. Here's another issue, that was a good one. But you start having, weird things happen, all of a sudden they run into these characters, the massacre's kind of behind them now. He's moving on with the book, and you never really find out what happened. Why did they go down there and do this? Who hired them? Somebody hired them. Who hired the Marauders to go down there and wipe out, the Morlocks, and eventually you just forgot about it if you even noticed. The story was so good you didn't really worry about it. And all of a sudden they're like, you get 3 new members to the X-Men, Dazzler, Longshot, and Psylocke's on there now. It's gotten established in them. Then they led up to Jubilee, and they're in Australia and everything like that. But this book was so popular, this run was such a hit, that they started building up for the next one. All of a sudden this became a yearly event, and now in comics, with us having a major event quarterly for Marvel and yearly from DC now and all this stuff over the years and stuff like that, this is when it was new and fresh. And you knew things had changed. No more Angel. Angel lost his wings. And they did this great issue where they thought he died. And they started leading up to things to where this led to the next big event a year later, Fall of the Mutants. And we get Archangel, And Archangel is working for Apocalypse. He's one of, this is our Angel. This is Warren Worthington III, man. He's got the blood of Apocalypse in him that changed him. He's got razors coming out of his wings there and stuff. You're like, oh my God, And the X-Men, all this was coming to a big climax where you had X-Men versus X-Force, I think, and Fall of the Mutants, I think, finally and stuff. Just some bad stuff going on. And that led up to Inferno a year later and stuff like that. Where this was kind of more New Mutants driven in a way. A lot of people don't realize that, because it's the demons that had appeared in Colossus's sisters miniseries years later of with Sim and all of them like that. The demons were coming over and things were becoming animated, like elevators and buildings and cars, and you walk into an elevator, you get swallowed because now it's a monster and the elevator's its mouth and stuff. And we get the Madeline Pryor becomes the Goblin Queen. Since Jean Grey's back, they had to do something with Madeline Pryor, and that led up to Extinction Agenda. I mean, this thing every year became an event, and it all started with the Morlock Massacre and stuff. Let me see, I'm sure I'm not skipping ahead here and stuff. Like I said, that's actually where an era of the X-Men ended and a new one started, and that really bothered a lot of people who were the big X-Men enthusiasts, okay? Anyway, that's a quick little synopsis. Morlock Massacre, I give it a thumbs up. I enjoyed it. It was quite the event, and it actually holds up, I think. I think it's more well done than a lot of things that they've tried. But then again, it was fresh, it was new, it was spontaneous, and they were kind of making the rules, and it put the writers through hell doing it. So, good stuff. Good stuff. Alright guys, let's see if we can go to sleep now.